At 12:01 in the morning, Wednesday, a 50% tariff was set to hit nearly $20 billion worth of Canadian goods crossing into the United States. Not steel, not lumber, dairy, wine, hockey sticks, cement, down jackets, and unlike almost every other tariff Donald Trump has imposed since returning to office, this one comes with no exemption for goods that comply with the very trade agreement the two countries signed during his first term. That detail alone is why trade lawyers, customs brokers, and diplomats on both sides of the border spent the past 2 weeks working phones and hotel rooms in Washington, trying to stop a deadline that, as of this recording, has still not been averted. To understand how Ottawa and Washington arrived at this point, you have to go back roughly 18 months to February of 2025, when the current trade war between the United States and its northern neighbor first ignited. According to Wikipedia's ongoing documentation of the dispute, the United States imposed tariffs on Canada and Mexico that took effect on March 4, 2025, and Canada responded almost immediately with retaliatory tariffs of its own. What followed was not just a government-to-government dispute. It became a consumer movement. Millions of Canadians began boycotting American products and travel, canceling trips south of the border, pulling American liquor off provincial shelves, and shifting purchasing toward domestic and non-U.S. alternatives. That boycott, which is still active according to tracking by Wikipedia's Canadian boycott entry, was fueled in large part by Trump's repeated public suggestion that Canada should become the 51st American state, a comment Canadian officials and much of the Canadian public treated as a serious insult to national sovereignty rather than a joke. Ottawa's relationship with Washington had, for decades before this, been described by trade officials as one of the closest economic partnerships on earth. The Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, known as CUSMA in Canada and USMCA in the United States, was negotiated during Trump's first administration specifically to replace the North American Free Trade Agreement, and it was supposed to lock in predictable, low-friction trade between the three countries. That predictability began to erode this year. According to the law firm Blake's, which has been tracking the tariff timeline in detail, the CUSMA Free Trade Commission conducted its first mandatory 6-year joint review of the agreement, a review built into the treaty's own text. The United States, per that same review process, did not agree to extend the deal for another 16-year term. In trade policy terms, that is a significant signal. It tells markets and trading partners that the foundation Canada has built decades of cross-border manufacturing and agricultural supply chains on is no longer treated as settled by the American side. Then came July. On July 20th, 2026, President Trump announced that he would impose 50% tariffs on most Canadian goods, effective in 30 days, unless Canada dropped what his administration called discriminatory trade barriers against American products, according to reporting from the Washington Post. That 30-day clock is what put August 19 on the calendar as the day everything changes, or doesn't. The White House, in a formal fact sheet released the same week, laid out its legal basis. Under Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, the President invoked authority to impose additional tariffs on a country when that country is found to discriminate against American exporters compared with exporters from other nations. According to the law firm Wiley, which published a detailed alert on the proclamations, Section 338 caps tariffs at 50% and allows them to take effect 30 days after being proclaimed, which lines up exactly with the August 19th date. 3 separate presidential proclamations were issued to formalize the move, and the Office of the United States Trade Representative confirmed the measures would affect close to $20 billion in annual imports from Canada. What specifically is Washington's complaint? The White House fact sheet points to 3 main grievances. First, automobiles. Canada imposes tariffs and quotas on vehicles imported from the United States that it does not apply to vehicles from other countries. And according to the administration's own figures, Canadian imports of American motor vehicles fell by roughly 22%, or $5.6 billion, between April 2025 and March 2026, compared with the prior year. Second, alcohol. The fact sheet states that Canadian imports of American alcoholic beverages collapsed by about 81% between March 2025 and February 2026, a direct consequence of several Canadian provinces pulling U.S. liquor from government-run store shelves in retaliation for the original round of tariffs. Third, dairy. Washington has repeatedly criticized Canada's supply-managed dairy system, which uses quotas and high tariffs above those quotas to protect domestic dairy farmers, arguing that it locks American producers out of a market where, in Washington's telling, Canada has offered more generous access to the European Union than to the United States. Canada's position, articulated most consistently by Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc and by Prime Minister Mark Carney, is that these measures amount to economic coercion layered on top of a treaty the U.S. itself once championed. Carney, speaking about the broader negotiations, made a pledge that Bloomberg reported he has repeated many times since taking office. Canada will not accept a bad deal. That single line has effectively become the Canadian government's public red line throughout months of talks, a way of signaling to Canadians worried about capitulation that Ottawa sees limits on what it will trade away, even under pressure from a 50% tariff clock. So what has actually been happening in the room, or rather in the rooms, because there have been several? According to CTV News, LeBlanc met with United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer for a second time in less than a week around August 11th, alongside Canada's chief trade negotiator Janice Charette. LeBlanc, speaking in French on his way into that meeting, was asked whether he believed a deal could be reached before the deadline. He said simply that he hoped so. Former Canadian ambassador to the United States, David McNaughton, told CTV News that Team Canada arrived with a fairly substantial package to discuss, but he cautioned that the American side did not appear ready for a comprehensive agreement. Bloomberg's reporting from August 13th, credited to Brian Platt, Josh Wingrove, and Nojod Al-Mallis, captured the atmosphere in Ottawa as one of walking a political tightrope for Carney, who has to balance provincial premiers, domestic dairy and auto interests, and a Canadian public still angry over the annexation rhetoric, against the practical need to keep nearly $400 billion in annual two-way trade functioning. According to BNN Bloomberg, LeBlanc and Charette met with Greer for a third time in as many weeks on August 12th. And LeBlanc posted afterward that Canada remained committed at the negotiating table to advance and defend Canadian interests. Greer, for his part, has been explicit about why these tariffs exist at all. According to BNN Bloomberg's reporting, Greer said the 50% tariffs are a direct response to provincial bans on American liquor, Canada's dairy supply management system, and Canadian quotas on certain U.S.-built vehicles. In other words, this is not a broad, unfocused trade dispute. It is targeted retaliation for three specific Canadian policies that Washington has decided to treat as discriminatory under U.S. trade law. Here is where the story gets tense rather than merely procedural. CBC News, in reporting published August 12th and updated August 13th, cited two sources with direct knowledge of the talks who said Canada and the United States were not yet at a point where a deal could realistically be reached, and that Canadian officials were unsatisfied with the latest American offer. According to those sources, the Americans proposed on that Tuesday to lower some of the sectoral tariffs, but not by nearly enough for Ottawa's liking. CBC noted it was not naming the sources because they were not authorized to discuss the negotiations publicly, a standard caveat that signals real uncertainty rather than a done deal being spun for the cameras. Then came a warning that, according to the Globe and Mail's Adrian Morrow, went further than the usual diplomatic language. Janice Charette, Canada's top negotiator, reportedly told her American counterparts in a meeting the previous week that if the White House proceeds with the August 19 tariffs, it would represent what she called a cliff, a moment that risks halting the negotiations altogether rather than simply raising the temperature further. 5 sources briefed on the discussions described that warning to the Globe and Mail. Brian Clough, a former deputy chief of staff who has advised on Canada-U.S. relations, told the outlet that the very fact these talks have continued as long and as intensely as they have is itself notable, given how adversarial the underlying dispute has become. Meanwhile, away from the negotiating table, Canadian businesses have been forced to make a strategic bet. According to BNN Bloomberg's reporting from Montreal on August 14th, industry insiders say companies this time are choosing not to rush shipments across the border to beat the deadline, unlike the front-loading behavior seen during earlier rounds of tariff threats last year. Janine Harker, who heads the Canadian Society of Customs Brokers, described businesses as having settled into a posture of watchful waiting rather than panic. Part of that calm, according to the same reporting, comes from a phenomenon traders have started calling TACO, shorthand for Trump always chickens out, a reference to the president's pattern of announcing severe tariff deadlines that are later delayed, softened, or partially reversed once negotiations produce a face-saving alternative. Whether that pattern holds this time is, of course, an open question, and one this script is not going to pretend to answer with false certainty. There's also a broader tariff architecture sitting underneath this specific 50% measure, and it matters for understanding just how layered Canada's trade relationship with the United States has become. According to the legal tracking maintained by Blake's effective June 8, 2026, the United States adjusted its tariff regime for aluminum, steel, and copper imports, lowering rates on certain derivative products. Separately, effective July 24, 2026, a new forced labor-related tariff regime took hold, applying a 10% tariff on imports from countries that have committed to adopting and enforcing bans on goods made with forced labor, and 12.5% on those that have not, though CUSMA-compliant Canadian products were exempted from that particular measure. The Office of the United States Trade Representative found that 60 foreign economies, Canada included, had failed to adequately enforce forced labor import prohibitions, which is part of the broader pattern of the Trump administration using multiple overlapping tariff tools rather than a single blanket measure. On the Canadian side, The government in the Yukon, according to the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses Tariff Tracker, has allocated $1 million toward a business assistance program meant to help companies in the territory adapt to what the tracker describes as the uncertain economic environment created by these tariffs, funded through the 2025-2026 budget. That is a small, localized example, but it illustrates something important about how deep the disruption has reached. This is not only a story about federal negotiators in Washington hotel conference rooms. It is a story that has pushed provincial and territorial governments in Canada to start building their own economic buffers, because businesses cannot simply wait indefinitely for Ottawa and Washington to sort things out. It is worth pausing on the retaliatory tariffs Canada itself has been running, because they are part of why some analysts describe this as a genuine trade war rather than a one-sided tariff campaign. According to the Wikipedia entry tracking the broader United States trade war with Canada and Mexico, Canadian retaliatory tariffs began the same day the original American tariffs took effect, on March 4, 2025. And the Canadian government subsequently dropped the majority of those retaliatory measures starting August 22nd of that year, a gesture widely read at the time as an attempt to de-escalate and create room for negotiation. That earlier de-escalation did not stop Washington from moving forward with the Section 338 tariffs a year later, which is part of why some Canadian officials and commentators have expressed frustration that goodwill gestures from Ottawa have not consistently been matched by reciprocal steps from Washington. Leadership on the Canadian side has also changed hands during this period. Justin Trudeau led the government when the original tariffs hit in early 2025, and Mark Carney took over as Prime Minister that March, inheriting a trade relationship already in crisis, and choosing, based on his public statements since, to frame his approach around firmness rather than rapid concession. The auto sector dispute in particular has a longer history than the current headlines suggest, and it helps explain why Washington keeps returning to it as a central grievance. Canadian quotas on American-built vehicles date back years and were designed, according to the White House's own framing, in a way that effectively pressures U.S. automakers to build assembly capacity inside Canada, rather than shipping finished vehicles north from American plants. From Washington's perspective, that arrangement disadvantages American auto workers in manufacturing regions, even though Canada and the U.S. operate under the same CUSMA framework that is supposed to guarantee largely tariff-free automotive trade between the two countries. From Ottawa's perspective, the quota system reflects decades of integrated North American auto manufacturing, where Canadian plants, workers, and parts suppliers are already deeply embedded in the same supply chains as their American counterparts, making the current dispute feel to many in Canada's auto-producing regions like a threat to an integrated industry rather than a fix for a one-sided imbalance. Now to the most recent and arguably the most consequential development. According to the Washington Post's David J. Lynch, reporting published the morning of August 15th, the United States and Canada were, in his words, inching closer to a deal to avert the imposition of the punitive 50% tariffs on products like hockey sticks, wine, and cement. That reporting was based on conversations with industry executives and trade specialists following the talks directly. Then, in an update from the Detroit News, dated the evening of August 16th, citing sources speaking on condition of anonymity because the deliberations remain confidential, more detail emerged about what an emerging accord might actually contain. According to that reporting, the shape of a possible deal would pair Canadian tariff concessions with new commitments from Ottawa on energy, defense, and critical minerals, in exchange for Washington agreeing to shelve the new Section 338 tariffs and relax the existing levies on steel and aluminum. The same report was careful to note that details remain fluid, and that talks in the days immediately before the deadline were, in fact, contentious rather than smooth. That word fluid is worth sitting with for a moment because it captures exactly where this story stands as of this recording. There's no confirmed, signed agreement. There's a reported direction of travel, sourced to people close to the negotiations, but not to an on-record government announcement from either Ottawa or Washington. It is entirely possible that by the time you are watching this, the 50% tariffs described throughout this script have already taken effect at 12:01 Wednesday morning, or that they have been postponed, or that a partial framework has been announced covering some sectors but not others. The honest answer, based on everything verified in the reporting above, is that neither outcome had been locked in as of the most recent confirmed sourcing. It is worth stepping back and asking why this particular dispute matters so much beyond the specific dollar figures involved. The United States and Canada share the longest bilateral trading relationship of almost any two countries on Earth. According to the Claims Journal's reporting, which cited U.S. trade representative figures, the United States imported roughly $382 billion worth of goods from Canada in the relevant period, meaning the $20 billion directly targeted by these new 50% tariffs, while enormous in absolute terms, represents a slice of a much larger economic relationship that includes energy, automobiles, machinery, and agricultural products moving across the border in both directions every single day. Ottawa's dilemma is that even a slice this size, concentrated in supply-managed dairy, provincially controlled alcohol sales, and the auto sector, touches politically sensitive constituencies that Carney's government cannot simply write off without domestic backlash. On the American side, the White House fact sheet frames the entire tariff strategy, not just the Canada-specific measures, as part of a broader push to rebuild domestic manufacturing. The same document cites figures claiming that U.S. manufacturing grew at its fastest rate in 4 years in May 2026, nearly tripling expectations, and expanded for a sixth consecutive month in June 2026. Whether that growth is attributable to the tariff regime specifically or to other economic factors running in parallel is a matter of genuine economic debate among analysts, and this script is not going to present the administration's causal claim as settled fact. It is presented here as the argument the White House itself is making, sourced directly to its own fact sheet, not as an independently verified outcome. There's also a legal dimension worth understanding, because Section 338 is not the tool most people associate with Trump-era tariffs. It has been used far less frequently than Section 232, the national security provision behind the earlier steel, aluminum, copper, and automobile tariffs, or Section 301, the unfair trade practices provision used extensively against China in prior years. According to Wiley's legal analysis, Section 338 specifically targets situations where a foreign country is found to discriminate against American exporters relative to how it treats exporters from other countries, which is precisely the argument Washington is making about Canada's auto quotas, dairy access, and alcohol restrictions. The statute also gives the president broad discretion to suspend, revoke, supplement, or amend the tariff proclamation at any point, which is a legally important detail, because it means that even if the 50% tariffs technically take effect on August 19th, the president retains the authority to walk them back quickly if a deal is subsequently reached, without needing new congressional action or a lengthy new proclamation process. Let's talk about what happens on the ground if these tariffs do take full effect. A 50% tariff on Canadian dairy products would land on top of Canada's own domestic supply management system, effectively pricing many Canadian dairy exports out of competitiveness in the American market almost overnight. For provincial liquor boards, many of which already pulled American products from shelves as a retaliatory measure last year, a 50% tariff on the Canadian alcohol still crossing the border, primarily wine and certain spirits, would compound an already steep decline in cross-border alcohol trade that the White House itself measured at roughly 81%. And in the so-called motor vehicles category, which, despite its name, covers everything from furniture and building materials to cosmetics, toys, and clothing rather than actual cars, businesses across more than a dozen distinct Canadian industries, according to the Canadian Federation of Independent Business Tracker, would face an immediate, dramatic increase in the cost of selling into their largest export market. For Ottawa, the political calculation is delicate in a way that goes beyond simple economics. Carney came into office promising not to accept what he has repeatedly called a bad deal, language that resonates with the Canadian public still frustrated by the earlier annexation comments and the sweeping tariffs of 2025. But Charrette's own warning to American negotiators that the August 19th deadline itself represents a cliff that could halt talks entirely suggests that Canadian officials understand the tariffs are not just an economic cost to absorb, they are a potential circuit breaker for the entire negotiating process. If the tariffs take effect and Ottawa concludes that further talks are pointless under active 50% duties, the dispute could shift from active negotiation to a more prolonged standoff, with unclear timelines for resolution. For Washington, the calculation is different but no less political. The Trump administration has built much of its trade policy narrative around the idea of using tariffs as leverage to extract concrete concessions, and a visible retreat from the August 19th deadline without securing meaningful commitments from Canada would run counter to that narrative, particularly given how publicly the deadline has been set and reset since Trump's original July 20th announcement. And that is part of why the emerging framework described by the Detroit News, pairing tariff relief with Canadian commitments on energy, defense, and critical minerals, would give the administration something concrete to point to as a win, rather than a simple postponement. It is also worth noting what these talks are not about, because there has been some public confusion on this point. This dispute is not primarily about the broader steel, aluminum, and copper tariffs imposed under Section 232, although those tariffs do form part of the backdrop and are reportedly part of the broader package under discussion, according to the Detroit News sourcing. It is not primarily about the forced labor tariff regime that took effect July 24th, since Canadian CUSMA compliant goods were largely exempted from that measure. This specific 50% tariff and this specific August 19th deadline is about three targeted grievances: automotive quotas, provincial alcohol restrictions, and dairy supply management, layered on top of a broader relationship that has been under strain since Trump's first tariff actions against Canada back in early 2025. Where does that leave things heading into the deadline itself? Based on everything confirmed across multiple named outlets, here is the most accurate picture available. As of Bloomberg's August 13th reporting, LeBlanc and Charette had met with Greer 3 times in 3 weeks, with talks described as ongoing but not yet resolved. As of CBC's reporting from that same window, Canada remained unsatisfied with the latest American proposal on the table. As of the Globe and Mail's reporting, Canada's own chief negotiator had explicitly warned that the deadline itself risked derailing the process. And as of the most recent confirmed reporting from the Washington Post and the Detroit News, published August 15th and August 16th, respectively, the two sides appeared to be moving toward some form of accord, built around Canadian concessions on tariffs, paired with new commitments in energy, defense, and critical minerals in exchange for the U of Bordeaux. Shelving the Section 338 tariffs and easing steel and aluminum duties, though those same reports stressed that details remained unsettled and talks had turned contentious in the closing stretch before the deadline. To be fully transparent about the state of verification here, the sources underpinning this script are Reuters, adjacent wire, and major outlet reporting, including the Washington Post, Bloomberg, CBC News, the Globe and Mail, CTV News, BNN Bloomberg, and the Detroit News, alongside primary government documentation from the White House and the Office of the United States Trade Representative, and legal analysis from the firms Wiley and Blakes. Several of the most recent and most consequential claims, particularly the specific shape of the emerging deal involving energy, defense, and critical minerals commitments, are sourced to anonymous industry executives and unnamed officials speaking on condition of anonymity, as reported by named journalists at named outlets, rather than to an on-record government confirmation from either Ottawa or Washington. That distinction matters. It means the broad direction, the talks intensified and a framework began to take shape in the final days before the deadline, is well supported across multiple independent outlets. But the precise final terms of any agreement had not been officially confirmed by either government as of the most recent verified reporting used for this script. Whether the 50% tariffs actually took effect at 12:01 Wednesday morning, whether they were postponed, or whether a partial deal was struck covering only some of the disputed sectors, remains, as of this recording, something to verify against the latest headlines rather than treat as settled by anything stated here. There's a pattern worth watching for anyone following this relationship going forward, and it is one that has repeated itself several times since Trump's return to office. A hard deadline gets announced. Negotiators intensify their meetings in the final 1 to 2 weeks. Sources close to the talks leak details of a possible framework just before the deadline hits. And then, either the deadline passes with tariffs taking effect as threatened, or a last-minute arrangement is announced that softens or delays the impact. Businesses on the Canadian side, according to the Customs Brokers Association reporting from BNN Bloomberg, have essentially adapted their operating posture to this pattern, choosing to wait rather than scramble, a sign that the unpredictability itself has become a factor. Companies now plan around rather than treat as a genuine shock each time. What makes Ottawa's position particularly difficult in this specific round is the absence of a CUSMA exemption. Every previous major tariff action from the Trump administration against Canada, whether on steel, aluminum, or automobiles, generally carved out some space for goods that complied with the trade agreement the two countries themselves negotiated and signed. This 50% measure does not. That is the detail that transforms this from another round of sectoral pressure into something Canadian officials, including Charette in her private warning to American counterparts, are treating as qualitatively different and more dangerous to the broader trading relationship. If a country can face full tariffs even while fully complying with the free trade agreement it signed with the country imposing them, that raises a much larger question about what the value of such agreements actually is going forward. A question that extends well beyond this single dispute and into how Canada and other American trading partners watching closely think about the durability of any future deal they might strike with Washington. Let's also put the raw dollar figures in perspective one more time, because numbers this large can start to feel abstract. $20 billion in targeted goods sounds enormous until you set it against the full scope of what actually crosses the Canada-U.S. border. Energy alone, oil, natural gas, hydroelectricity, and refined products moving south from Canada dwarfs the $20 billion figure at the center of this specific dispute. That is precisely why the reported shape of the emerging framework, according to the Detroit News, includes new Canadian commitments on energy alongside defense and critical minerals. If Ottawa is going to offer Washington something valuable enough to justify shelving a 50% tariff regime, Negotiators on both sides understand that the offer likely has to extend beyond the three narrow sectors currently under direct dispute, reaching into the parts of the relationship, energy security and critical minerals, supply chains in particular, that carry strategic weight well beyond dairy quotas or provincial liquor shelves. Critical minerals deserve a moment of their own context here, because it is not a throwaway line in the reporting. Canada holds significant reserves of minerals the United States has identified as essential to its own manufacturing and defense industrial base. Everything from nickel and cobalt to rare earth elements used in electronics, batteries, and military hardware. Washington has spent much of the past 2 years across multiple trade negotiations with multiple countries, trying to reduce dependence on adversarial nations for exactly these inputs, a priority the White House fact sheet itself references when it talks about diversifying global supply chains. A Canadian commitment on critical minerals access, then, is not just a symbolic concession thrown in to sweeten a deal. It would touch one of the more strategically significant pieces of the entire North American economic relationship, which is part of why sources described it to the Detroit News as a serious component of the framework under discussion rather than a minor add-on. None of this guarantees a resolution by the deadline, and it is worth repeating because it is the most responsible way to close out a story that is still actively unfolding. As of the most recent verified reporting used to build this script, there was no confirmed on-record agreement between Ottawa and Washington. There was intensifying negotiation, a reported direction toward a framework, and a hard deadline that both sides publicly acknowledged carried real risk of derailing the entire process if it passed without a deal. Those three things can all be true at once, and viewers watching this unfold in real time should treat any claim of a finalized agreement with appropriate skepticism until it is confirmed directly by LeBlanc's office, the Prime Minister's office in Ottawa, or the White House and Office of the United States Trade Representative in Washington. So where does this leave the story as it stands right now in Ottawa and Washington, and for the businesses and consumers caught in between? The honest, source-backed answer is unresolved but moving. Two governments that have spent close to a decade building an unusually close economic relationship are now negotiating under real-time pressure over whether that relationship absorbs a historic tariff shock or finds a last-minute off-ramp. The people doing the negotiating, LeBlanc, Charette, and Greer, have met repeatedly, described by multiple outlets as 3 times in 3 weeks at a minimum. The political leaders framing the stakes, Carney and Trump, have each staked out public positions that leave them limited room to simply cave without cost. And the reporting closest to the deadline itself suggests a framework is forming, even if its final shape and whether it arrives in time remained genuinely uncertain as of the most recently verified sourcing available for this script. What do you think happens next? Does Ottawa hold the line Carney has publicly promised, even if it means absorbing 50% tariffs on billions of dollars in exports? Or does a last-minute framework built around energy, defense, and critical minerals commitments give both sides enough political cover to step back from the edge? And, longer term, does a tariff regime with no CUSMA exemption change how Canada, or any other American trading partner, thinks about the value of signing a free trade agreement with Washington in the first place? Drop your take in the comments. We genuinely want to know where you land on this one. If this breakdown helped you understand where things actually stand, share it with someone who has been asking what's going on with these tariffs, because most headlines on this story are either months out of date or missing half the context laid out here. And if you want the moment this deadline actually resolves, one way or the other, make sure you're subscribed, because we will be back with the confirmed outcome as soon as either government makes it official. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.